Hello, I'm Beverly Lane with Roxanne Wiedemann Lindsay. I was the co-chair for this exhibit. And the exhibit is called Cowboys and Cattleman Ranching in the San Ramon Valley. So I was here at the Museum of the San Ramon Valley in the winter of 2014. And this is part of the exhibit in this room. We're talking about cowboys and cattlemen, but before the gold rush, of course, it was vaqueros y rancheros. The cattle first came to California with the Spanish in the late 18th century. And so we have things here in the exhibit that represent those cattle and sheep coming to the valley. So behind me we have pictures of two of the missions with cattle and with sheep. One is in Southern California and the other is in Mission San Jose. In this case, we have some really interesting items, including a carreta model, which is a kind of cart that they moved around on, Mexican-style spurs, a hackamore, spade bits, and wooden stirrups. So cattle came with the Mexicans, or the Spanish and the Mexicans, and they grew exponentially here. They loved the Mediterranean weather. They brought the types of grasses they like with them really on their coats, and there were millions of cattle that grazed here before the gold rush. So when the ranchos began in the 1820s, we had two major ranchos here in the San Ramon Valley, and we here have pictures of them. We've got the Amador Rancho and the Castro Pacheco Rancho, as well as a map that shows what Mexican ranchos were carved from Mission San Jose's recruitment land. So you can see from this map that from San Leandro up to Concord, cattle were grazed by Mission San Jose, and they later became ranchos. So one of the things that we have that's interesting here that Don Wood did was he created some small size branding irons which represent the brands that were on cattle before the gold rush. So we have Castro, we have Mission San Jose, we have Pacheco, and we have Amador's brand. So children and adults who are interested can come and actually see what the brand looked like in miniature size on a cattle hide. So this is our Vaqueros and Ranchos section, and we hope people enjoy the video tour of our exhibit. Thank you.
Well, I'm Jeff Wiedemann, another of this group of fine ranchers and ranching families. My great-grandfather Christian is portrayed over here, probably back in the late 1800s sometime. There's a little uncertainty about when he exactly arrived, but it was back during the post-gold rush era, and ended up in San Ramon probably in the 1850s or early 60s. Originally from an area between Denmark and Germany that is in northern Germany now. And he was a ship's carpenter by trade. Came around the Horn on a ship, and everyone was abandoning the ships in the San Francisco Bay, so he said, well, I guess I better go do something else, and went off to the Cow Palace, met up with some friends there, worked on a dairy for a while, and eventually purchased the land in San Ramon. And aside from that, a good guy, some history about him. He was active in the community with various groups, I think the Odd Fellows, and anyway, helping to establish San Ramon. It was a pretty small town at that time, so it must have been pretty interesting. Thanks.
And he sold
Oh, yeah, he was busy. That's not me. Oh, shoot.
We're talking history and
Yes, might have to cut. Well, yeah. So he sold firewood. You know, the property that family began with was pretty steep country and a lot of oak trees, and so they said, well, we'll cut the trees down and provide pasture land for cattle, and basically transformed the land into a business, and expanded quite a bit over the next few decades.
Okay, thank you.
My great-grandfather was one of the 3 early ranchers in this area, and this picture here is in the center. He was instrumental in establishing the Grange in the valley, and he was also a state representative for a couple of years. I don't know if he ran for election again or if he just got defeated. And his son was involved in the establishment of the local San Ramon High School, and he moved on to the ranch in Sycamore Valley in 1862, and we as a family have been there ever since, and there's a plaque there that shows that recognition from the California Agricultural Heritage Club for 150 years in one location. We're not very much in business anymore, but we still are there.
Good morning again. I'm Gordon Rasmussen, representing my grandfather, John C. Rasmussen, who actually came to the valley in 1885 and then bought a ranch, the same ranch that I'm on, in 1913, and last year they made our ranch a historical ranch for celebrating 100 years on the same ranch. So that's a picture of my grandfather, John, and kind of proud to have him up there among such gallant gentlemen as the Wiedemann and Don Wood's great-grandfather. But I think if our grandfathers, kind of all in the same little display, could look out and see the family is still carrying on, they would be very pleased. So that's my story about there's a picture of the ranch that still exists down like it is today.
With the assistance of several of the other old-timers in this valley, we tried to make a map here which shows the ranches that used to exist, and they are printed in black ink. And then there are ranches that still exist, which are in red ink, and I just counted them. It looks like there's 37 of them still in operation in this general area, in the San Ramon Valley and Tasajara areas. What's our school district? Santa Fe Valley Unified School District, yeah. And so the only way I thought we could show that was by using a color code on those labels, and they're in just general proximity to where they were. But there are ranches that are still in business. There's ranches that were in business, have been taken over. There are ranches that are now parkland that are represented in orange here, or the name of the lessee on the parkland is in orange. The previous owners are in other colors. So it takes quite a bit of studying to figure out what that is, and it is just a collection of our memories. And what we've said along the way, we have a disclaimer here, is that if you don't like what we did here, tell us about it and we'll change it. So.
All right, Don. So also, you want to say a little word about this saddle? We have saddles as part of the exhibit.
Well,
Your family.
Yeah, well, Bev wanted a saddle for kids to sit in for purpose of having their picture taken, along with the hats that she loaned them so they could look like little cowboys. Anyway, that saddle was my uncle's saddle. It was made specifically for him. He was a little guy, and it was made for him when he was in the Forest Service up in Susanville. It's made by Visalia stock saddle, a fellow named Walker, so it's a relatively famous maker. And when he moved to the San Francisco office out of the forest, why, he left the saddle on the ranch and his horse there, and the horse died there and the saddle just got dusty. Anyway, Frida Cattleman cleaned it up and put it down here for the use of the museum.
Okay, thank you, Don. We'll talk a little bit about the Black Hawk Ranch in Doherty Valley. Black Hawk Ranch was purchased in 1917 by the Easton family. They were known for their championship Shire horses and their shorthorn cattle. And they won awards at the State Fair, some really prestigious recognition. It was a huge ranch at one time, covering well over 6,000 acres in the foothills of Mount Diablo. And the ranch eventually went to where the Black Hawk community is now. The reason it was Black Hawk is not because of a bird, but because of the Shire stud that they brought from Ireland was Black Hawk. And that was how the ranch came to be named. Another ranch out in the Doherty Valley, other ranches in the Doherty Valley also covered a large area, land leased from the Doherty family. My great-uncle Henry Wiedemann had a home there and ran cattle and had crops. The Nielsen's were one of the later families there that used the Banky Ranch, and the Banky Ranch was on Doherty Valley Road. Nielsen is a large family cattle operation throughout the state and other states that are still in business. A family that was not in the Doherty Valley, but San Ramon, Crow Canyon, and various other locations is the Elworthys. They still operate after generations. The Elworthy Baldwin families were married in the early 1900s, and the ranch was established, and great-grandchildren are operating the ranch now, and Herb Elworthy is the father who is there. As I mentioned, the Banky Ranch on Doherty Valley. There's the McGee Ranch, and a lot of these names have been used on roads and in a variety of ways. And the McGee Ranch, Hap McGee made famous, and it is a park now also for the town of Danville and Alamo. They ran cattle, and descendants of that family are still running cattle and doing cattle operations throughout the valley. Jed McGee and Ned Wood and Tom McGee are ranching still. Other ranches that are well known and produce quality stock was the Henry Ranch. Gerald Henry and his father and Gerald's sons had prize-winning Angus bulls that were valued by a lot of the local ranchers when they turned to Angus as opposed to Hereford cattle. That's something about some of the other local ranchers that were operating, and their land is still used for agriculture and livestock. And that's all.
Well, I'm Don Wood. I'm a member of the fourth generation of a family that's been here in the valley, and we had the Wood Ranch in Sycamore Valley. And for this exhibit, which is called Cowboys and Cattleman, we have a selection of brands that were borrowed from cattlemen in this valley, and some of them are still used, some of them are just, they still own them, but they don't use them anymore, don't register them. But a brand is a permanent and instant mark of ownership on livestock. And the brand can be used for identifying other things, but it's only legal to use them on a animal, cow or a horse, if it has been registered with the state of California. Registered brands, brand registration costs $60 for 2 years, and the sale of an animal, even just one animal, has to be inspected by a state inspector, and the registration fees and the fee for the inspection cover the cost of that, so it's not a burden on the general population, but a program to protect the ownership of cattle. Brands generally need to be a fairly simple pattern. The better brands have very simple patterns in them that don't tend to blotch. Brands that are very complicated will blotch, and you can see this one here is kind of burnt on the wood. And this is a very interesting brand in that the branding iron was found in the excavation of one of the subdivisions in the valley. It's kind of strange that it was out here because it is a Peralta brand, and there are several Peraltas represented within the brand. I think I can pull this off of here and show you this. There was Louis Peralta, which would be the LP here, had most of the area, which is San Leandro, Berkeley, Oakland, Emeryville, as pasture land, and it was for his right to use it was from the Mission Dolores in San Francisco. But he had children, Antonio, so there's an A, there's the L for Louis, and he had another son, Ignacio. I'm not sure what the other is, but there's a sample of the too complicated brand that burns. But that iron had to have been made in the 1830s or before, and it's just kind of amazing that it's still around.
How they keep their hands cool while they're doing the branding.
All right. So branding iron design is up to the pattern is up to the owner of the brand. The way it's built is up to the blacksmith that made them. But anyway, almost all of them have to have some means of keeping the heat from the fire from going up the handle. And several examples of those are here. This one has just a little hole in it. Maybe not too effective. This one has a bigger hole in it that lets heat dissipate. This one has a piece of pipe in it which lets heat dissipate. And a couple of these have a sliding handle that can be kept away from the fire and slid down over a hot handle. There's another one that's made that way. This is an interesting iron. This one here was George Stegeman, and when he went to register his brand at the state, he wanted to get a bar GS, and when he got up there, the G was already taken. So he just turned his G backwards, and so he has a backwards GS to get his brand. So brands are issued on 6 places on the animal, both hips, both ribs, and both shoulders. And one person could own all of those brands, or they could be owned by 6 different people. So the brand pattern is specific to its location. And there are thousands of brands registered in California, and there's no indication that the Mexicans or the Spanish ever registered a brand, but in Contra Costa County, after the state became, well, California became a state, brands were registered in the county, and we have here under glass a Contra Costa County brand registration book. Elsewhere in the museum, there is a PS brand and a little wooden pattern like this of it. That is the oldest brand in continuous use in Contra Costa County, very likely in the state. And you can see that in the Wiedemann section. They bought the brand from the Povis family. It's a PS brand, and who used it in the 1850s. And when they bought the ranch, they bought the cattle and the brand, and they've used it continuously ever since. But as I said, there were thousands of brands registered in California. This is a 1973 book, which just shows all of them that were registered at that time. Brands are, of course, these are, I don't know if I mentioned in the first place, these are all hot iron brands, and they're normally heated in a fire of some sort, originally in wood fires, more recently in propane-fired furnaces. But also there are electric branding irons that have to have a source of electricity, but they get hot instantly, and they're very, very effective and very popular in this day and age, and there's two of them here that are made with that. Another thing about branding is that the hot iron brand damages the hide. And this is a sample of a piece of leather from an animal that had been branded with a hot iron brand, and it leaves it rough and leaves a pattern in there. So there is value in not hot iron branding if you don't have to worry about the ownership of your cattle or the cattle being stolen. There are alternatives which are not absolutely legal to livestock identification, and that would be ear tags, which are shown somewhere else in the exhibit, and more recently chips in the ears that are read from some distance away. Another means of branding is freeze branding, in which case a bronze iron, it's kind of a misnomer, but anyway, a bronze casting is cooled down to 18-20 degrees below zero and applied against the skin. And they're more commonly used on a horse, and they end up making the hair grow out white where they were. But it's not an instant thing, and so that's one of the reasons that freeze branding isn't an absolute mark of ownership. It'd be pretty hard to argue against, but anyway, it's not technically a fully legal thing. On cattle, just difference in the thickness of the hide or whatever, it takes about a minute of contact from the cold iron to make the hair grow out white, and it grows out over a period of a month or so afterwards.
Okay, well, thank you, Don. A little bit about the way people used to brand and the way people are branding now.
Well, it's still getting the same job done as far as putting a brand on an animal, because that is our code as to who owns the animal, and that's the use of a branding iron. This is the way we've all done it years ago. Bring the calves in, and you'd have your cowboy neighbors, and you'd rope individual each calf and put a brand on them. You can see up there in that picture, calf stretched out, and they're putting a brand on them. You've seen Don Wood had a great selection of brands over there, so that's what the different ranches had their own brand. And it was doing it this way over here, the old way, was really fun, because your neighbors were there, and you knew you were going to have a great barbecue after all the work was done, and it was kind of a competition thing to see who could brand or who could rope the best, and it was just a fun way of doing it. But then, like everything else, time became more valuable, and so we got sophisticated, and just all of us now have good branding chutes. You can see like up here on this side. So the cattle are really a lot easier on them because they're contained in either a hydraulic chute, or like this one here is a regular manual chute. But they hold the animal just absolutely still. It's not being thrashing around, and put the brand on it. Of course, when you have it in a position like that, you can check their feet and their eyes if there happen to be a foxtail. So this has lead-up trails, and the whole, it's just a much humane way of handling cattle over here. They're using a hot iron there, which means they've been put in a branding pot like this. I think this is one of Donald Wood's inventions. We all had different kinds of ways of heating our iron, but for the most part, we all use an electric iron. And it is a much better thing for the animal because this just remains the same temperature. You don't overheat it, or it's not too cold where it doesn't make a good brand. So this is what we call just a regular electric iron to equal whatever the iron that you used to have that was used with the propane. You can still enjoy what you're doing here, but not near the fun of 40, 50 years ago, the way we used to do it. And that's about it. Oh yeah, there's still, you know, if you're going to sometimes get cowboys onto your ranch to gather the cattle, which is still a big job, you almost will have to let those guys rope the calves because that's what they're really there for. So there's kind of a little program there where I haven't used cowboys for the last, I don't know, 5 or 6 years, but I get a lot of threats where they want to cut up my chute with a torch, or they want to haul it away or do sabotage work just so I can go back to having the party and the branding like we used to do it. But it's just because we're working with our neighbors, and it's always fun when you get a chance to do that. Mm-hmm.
I'll talk briefly about the farm women, although their job was so important. Starting with my great aunts, Mary and Rose, they cooked on a wood stove all the time. That was how they cooked. And that wood stove actually still operates, and we use it, but gosh, not on the regular basis that they had to. Needless to say, they went through a lot of firewood. They would cook not only over at the Norris Canyon Road Ranch headquarters, but the ranch also had a base out in the Doherty Valley, where Canyon Lake's lake is right now. So sometimes they would be out there cooking for the men when they were cutting hay and harvesting. So they would provide meals out that way. As part of their income, Mary and Rose raised turkeys. And we know from their journals that they sold a good deal of turkeys around Thanksgiving and Christmas time. They had, so this picture shows our yard filled with turkeys. I've raised a few, but that's a lot of turkeys that they had. They also had chickens and sold eggs. Now, Maddie Wiedemann was Fred's wife, and she helped with a lot of the cooking, journal keeping, and the women were active also in the community. They raised money to build a community hall in San Ramon. They had social clubs through the church and Rebecca's. They had community dances. So there was always a surprisingly large amount of outside activities besides the long days that they worked. My mother, Doris, we had an apricot field, apricot orchard that was on top of a hill. It was an experiment by the University of California. It's about an acre, and we would go up there when the apricots were ripe and pick them, pick a lot, and we would go to Hayward. Hayward High School had a cannery, so we could go and can the apricots, not in glass jars, but in metal cans. And I remember the shells of metal cans stored up for the wintertime, and they were wonderful. So the wives did, and the sisters and the women did so many different activities besides raising children. When there was a branding, a particularly large group, they would fix the meals for those cowboys and cattlemen. So you can see here, maybe a typical looking farm wife throughout the San Ramon Valley, but they were also pretty sophisticated people in their education and their activities. They appreciated culture and brought it to the San Ramon Valley. And that's it.
I'm Gordon Rasmussen, and they asked me to just talk a little bit about my saddle. I'm kind of proud of this saddle because I won this saddle through the California Cattlemen's Association. They had a membership drive, and if you'd gotten the most members, as I did that particular year, they gave you a saddle, and a real well-made saddle at that. It has on the fenders membership awards 1969. On the other side it says California Cattlemen's Association. This really is a nice saddle, made by Thistle up out of Red Bluff in that country. Anyway, that's the story on the saddle. I've been riding that saddle for 45 years, and they get to be a part of you. So that's the story of the saddle.
So I thought maybe it might be interesting for people to see some of the tools of the trade. Maybe just backing up a little bit. People are in the cattle business because they like cattle, and of course they like the lifestyle and working with nature and in it, but sometimes you have to take these kind of half-wild animals and get them in. They have, we vaccinate them for pneumonia, just like, people get vaccines and other pretty serious diseases. And when you get them in, you do certain things. This is a syringe. There would be a little needle on the end of it, and you fill it up with vaccine, and you kind of give every animal a little poke and try to put it in their neck so that they don't you don't contaminate the meat at all. Sometimes they'll get a sore eye, so you put a little patch on their eye there, and that keeps the flies off and the sunlight out. Sometimes we'll number them, and this little gadget here, you go click like that, and it's kind of like piercing, that's pretty big these days, but a little different. And so instead of a name, a cow might have a number, and all that. This part is a little gross, but I'll probably tell you about it anyway. The girls are gone. Oh, whoops! No, they're coming back. All right, so this glove is a one size fits all. Now I know nobody wants to guess what this is for, but if you want to find out if a cow is with child, then you take this thing and you lift up her tail and stick it in there and kind of feel around, and you feel just like, they don't do that in hospitals very much, but that's how we do it out on the range. Occasionally you'll have to remove horns. That's what this is for, like that. We try to, and most people these days try to eliminate horns on cattle genetically. So a lot of breeds don't have don't have horns, and so we don't have to cut them off. But back in the old days, when there was maybe a little bit less regard for the welfare of the animal, you would use an object like this to remove a large horn from a large animal. You can imagine that was probably pretty gruesome. You don't see these being used at all anymore, fortunately. Here's a little marker thing. It's kind of waxy. You can rub it on there and keep track of them. If a cow gets sick, you give them a pill or two, and sometimes 5 or 6 of these things, so you have to jam it down their throat, and then you push the thing and it comes out, and load it up again.
So why do you have to put it down their throat so far?
Well, otherwise they would spit it out, which they can do anyway. They have a very useful tongue, and unless you get it, past their tongue, they can kind of get it, and then they'll just patooey right back out again. And so it helps to get it into the back there a little bit, which, if you consider the size of a cow's head, it's not really going in that far. Oh, yeah. All right, what else do we have? Here are some horn weights. We used to have horned bulls, and if their horns were sticking straight out, they would go around poking each other and other things and people. So you put these weights on there, and over time the horn kind of bends down, and instead of a sharp, pointy object, they have kind of a rounded, little safer.
So on the end of the horn?
Put it right on the end of the horn, yeah. Mm-hmm. And in our case, about this time of year, when we want to wean the calves from their mothers, we put this little thing in their nose, and what it does is, here's the mother's udder, and it keeps the cow from being able to drink the milk, and it also kind of pokes the mother there a little bit, and she goes, "Oh, get away from me," and the calf is like, "Oh, no milk, I guess." And so it's a kind of a natural way to wean the calf from their mother. Otherwise, you're just tearing them apart, and they're all freaked out. And not too many people use those. We kind of like it. Other than that, I don't know if I left anything out. Probably have. Okay, here's a calf puller. So you got this calf out in the they have a cow trying to have a calf out in the woods somewhere, and far away from town or anything, and so you put this little thing around its feet, and the mother is struggling, and so you put this little chain around the calf's feet, and then and then of course you undo all this stuff, and then you pull it out, and you have to pull kind of down, like using gravity to help the calf come out, and so that you don't have to pull every one, but occasionally something will have a little trouble. So those are the tools of the trade. Yes. Yeah.
And it's one of the ways you keep your livestock healthy.
That's the goal. That's the goal. Happy and healthy. Our goal is to let them go out and have fun, wander around out on the range, and eat, be healthy, and all that.
Well, there's nothing in the cattle business that affected the way cattle were run or raised in this state and in the nation as much as barbed wire. Prior to barbed wire, cattle were run on open range, and everybody who had cattle out there had to go to a big roundup and separate their cattle and keep them separated and do their branding on their own rather than in the mutual pot. And here's an example of a lot of the wire that was developed in the valley. By 1870 or early 70s, there was about 400 different patents of barbed wire. And there are quite a few people with collections around. This one happens to be Jeff Wiedemann's, and It has some of the very old ones that had no give to them, and other ones that have a little bend in them that allow them to stretch when it's cold, and they lengthen when it's hot, and they would shrink a little bit when it's cold. There are two books here that really describe these patents, and it's kind of amazing that there are so many of them. Barbed wire comes in a row like you can see down below here. There are a few tools and staples that we use to fasten them to posts. This is what might be a typical fence without the part that goes into the ground, and the way the wires are spaced about 9 inches apart, a little more at the top. And anyway, that's a very common post. Years ago, the fences were built on wooden posts, required to dig a hole and tamp the post in tight. Was difficult. And prior to barbed wire, the fences had to be made with wooden boards or maybe rock piles or whatever happened to be around. So the barbed wire made a big difference, and it was the basis when the fences got built. Well, then the cattle were contained into one spot, and the old Roundup situation kind of changed to make cutting cattle out of a flock more of a hobby than a necessity, and it is now a very, very popular activity for cowboys to train and compete with their horses for the ability to cut cattle, and we have some buckles and things around the corner to describe that. Somebody came up, I don't know where it was, with a very unusual fence barbed wire tightening device. This thing could be hooked onto a post and grabs onto the piece of wire, and by pulling on a strap, it worked like a rope pulley to pull wire tight. And it's very unusual, but that could have been carried in a saddlebag or something, so a cowboy out in the field would have the means to tighten up the wire. Another means of tightening wire was a tool like this, and all it did was put a few more little kinks in the wire to take the slack out of it. Not a particularly strong way to tighten it, but it worked.
Morning. I'm Gordon Rasmussen. I'm a rancher, now getting to be one of the older ranchers out here, but family's been here over 100 years and raising cattle primarily, and in the early days crops of grain. But with the cattle we always had hay, because that was something you always had as your insurance policy to make sure you take care of these cattle during the winter months. And I don't know if Don mentioned, but we've come a long ways from the way we used to put up hay, and there's some pictures here that showing how we did it, bringing it down off the hills in hay shocks and using a Jackson fork. Here's a Jackson fork to put the hay from the hay shock up into the barn. And in my case, it was just my dad and I putting the hay in the barn. He would go after another hay shock. He'd put me up in the barn and scatter out that hay so it had what you call an even surface, because otherwise it wouldn't get packed on the edges.
So you just take loose hay?
Loose hay. Everything was loose hay. Here's a picture of putting loose hay using a beaver slide. But there was all kinds of methods. But the old days, then we got a little more sophisticated, and we baled the hay with a 5-wire baler, and we'd bring that down and put it in the barn. And we really thought we had accomplished something by having it baled. Now, in my day, this is a 3-wire bale, and even in Tassajara we put it up hay in a 3-wire bale. But I have a ranch in Dixon, and so we make that part of our main business of putting up hay in a 3-wire bale like this. And that's often irrigated pasture. So if we really got down and looked at this hay, you'd see a little bit of clover in there, and of course this hay's been sitting out like this, but it would have a little more color, and it would be very desirable for cattle or horses. For the most part, it's the cattleman that wants them, and so wants this hay. So we would actually I'd sell the hay to quite a few ranchers even in this area. Plus, a lot of my hay this year went to Petaluma because we actually put up quite a bit of hay.
So when you say quite a bit of hay, how many bales? 50?
We were talking about, let's see, 23,000. It would be right around 20-some thousand bales that we were putting up, or I did this year and last year. Yeah, yeah. And a hay like this would weigh. This hay this year was about 18 bales to the ton, but kind of a normal figure would be 20 bales to the ton. So then you could just sort of do your arithmetic real easy. If you wanted to give 10 pounds of hay to an animal, well, then you would know this bale of hay here would feed about 10 head of cows every day. So as you've probably been told, this year and even last, we've gone through a drought, and I guess I can't say I was lucky, but it gave us a little boosted market for the hay, and so we got a little premium in price on the hay. But it was part of our operation on the clover ranch. When I'd take the hay off the clover, off the ranch itself, then I could put cattle back on it, and I'd leave the cattle there until about October, 1st of November, and up there on that ranch sell them. And so there's.
So the hay has to be entirely dry before you bale it, right?
Yeah, it's so sophisticated anymore. They have a moisture meter on the baler, so when the guy is baling the hay, they have another thing that'll weigh the hay, so they want to say, well, we're going to produce a bale that's 18 bales to the ton, or we want to be in that bracket, so they don't want something that's just really fluffy light and not, making a real good product that would kind of go through its own little sweat. And hay is just something that is part of ranching. And there isn't a ranch that I've ever been on that doesn't put up hay. Whether you're up in Modoc and using the beaver slides, or using the old 3-wire press, but it's just part of our business.
So, do cattle be raised entirely on hay?
Oh yeah.
Not inexpensive, but
Yeah, just because of the competition for the hay, but that isn't our goal. It's just to supplement the cattle during the winter months when we don't have the grass and hopefully waiting on a rain. And then you throw out the hay.
So a lot of these ranches have great big barns.
Right.
And was that primarily for hay storage?
Oh, yes, just 100%. So you'd have barns that would be, like out in our area years ago, they even milked cows, and so part of the barn would be for the hay for the milk cows, and then we'd have what we call a stock barn, which was just fed hay for the feeder cattle or the dry cattle or whatever. So hay is just a very important part of the cattle business. That's what it all boils down to.
And you brought us 3 bales from Dixon.
3 bales from Dixon, just fairly decent hay. It's not perfect. This little sprig here is called Doc. Doesn't hurt anything, but you wouldn't want to see much of that I'm sure that little plant came from the neighbors. So, but anyway, that's our business with the hay. That represents maybe about 500 to 600 acres of clover hay where we irrigated it. So that's how we could kind of guarantee us a crop of hay up there.
So the hay that is here in San Ramon Valley, or you have out at San Ramon Valley, is not clover, it's dry.
It's just dry hay, but Out here in our area, we have burr clover, and it makes beautiful hay. You know, and that's just a native plant that will come up, and from year to different years, you'll have just a bale of hay like this would just be all burr clover, perfect hay. And that's as close to the clover hay as it would get to the kind that we have in Dixon.
So for cattle, this area has really good forage when it has the regular.
Very good, yeah. This is a perfect area for the cattle, because for the most part we don't have to supplement the cows. If you're really handling it and the weather was just perfect, we wouldn't even have to feed a bale of hay out here. And that's something that, you know, if you went north where the cold weather and all that, well, I've got friends up there that are feeding hay every day with a big crew, and I don't see a picture here of where they would load up a wagon with in the old days, of course, with a team of horses, but now they pull them with a tractor and just feed a lot of hay.
Okay, thank you very much.
My pleasure.
Let's see, I'll start with myself. Jeff Wiedemann, resident of Tassajara, formerly San Ramon, where the original Wiedemann Ranch began. Here's my grandfather, Fred, right here. Pretty well preserved.
We had him stuffed.
Yeah, I had him stuffed, and here's one of his saddles, and maybe I'll just go through what ranching is kind of about. And ours is a family, began several generations ago, like many others, and we're involved in the production of beef cattle, although that's also included farming walnuts and grain and hay and pigs and turkeys and all kinds of other things in the process. The ranch that Fred and his son and my father Howard developed over time, probably apexed in the 1950s, and covered nearly 9,000 or 10,000 acres, I guess, and some owned, some leased, and included quite a bit of orchard land and bottomland. I think they even experimented with dryland tomatoes at some point. So they're busy all year long. That was the one thing that you'll find with any rancher, is that they like to work, and so not always the best thing for them, but that's how it goes. But Fred is kind of the centerpiece. His father, Christian, started the place, but he was a bit more flamboyant, kind of a rodeo star, trick rider. You can see him picking up a handkerchief off the ground there in a full gallop, and he was involved with a lot of local horse activities, and as well as involved in the local Cattlemen's Association and all kinds of other stuff, the community hall, and but my sister Roxanne might be talking about that a little more as we go on. Let's see, what else is cooking? Just a few mementos on the walls here, kind of a reward thing for cattle wrestling. That still goes on a certain amount these days. Not quite as much maybe in the past, but get a few wrestlers out there. Oh, gee. So the roping thing, I think you guys got some stuff on the roping already. It's kind of a handy tool. You know, if you have a sick animal or something, you can throw a rope on it, and if you're lucky, kind of get it down on the ground where you can give it a shot, or, you know, take a rope wire off his leg or something. And so they're still somewhat useful. Gordon Rasmussen, I think, went over the roundups that we had back in the, you know, all the way probably starting in the 30s, and sort of a community effort. And Don Wood talked about the brands, which are the legal means of identification, still are today. You don't have to brand your cattle, and some people do, some don't, but if they're likely to get out into somebody else's pasture, if you don't have a brand, they're not really legally identified. And so cattle kind of wander around. They're not really, we think they're held by the fences, but they're not really. So let's see, am I missing anything here? I guess the shaps are not particularly practical. The shaps that were worn for work were much simpler than those. Those are probably, part of the fun rodeo stuff. Feed bag, you put some grain in here, and then the horse sticks his nose in, you hook it over his head, and they eat, which they're very good. People still use horses, although more ATVs these days. And gosh, I don't know what else. That kind of sums it up.
Okay,
so
we'll let Roxy talk about the house and.
Okay.
Jeff Wiedemann talked to you about Christian Wiedemann. The ranch land that he originally bought was purchased from a Union soldier's widow. The federal government didn't have enough money to pay the soldiers' widows, so they gave them land on the West Coast. So Christian bought some land from a widow, and his partner bought some land. So that was the beginning. It wasn't homesteaded or part of the Spanish land grant, but it was up in the hills. They built a home around 1867. Christian was getting married and starting a family, needed a place to live. His business, as Jeff said, was beef cattle and firewood. He needed to identify the cattle with a brand, so Mr. Povis, P-O-V-I-S, was selling out and going back home. So Christian bought the brand, the PS brand for Povis, but it became the Wiedemann brand, and he bought some cattle, and that was the beginning of the herd. That brand has been used continuously then since it was first registered in 1856 in Contra Costa County, and it's been used ever since the late 60s, 1860s, by the Wiedemann family. The house that Christian built, there were 7 children born, but only 4 of them lived, and that was Mary and Rose, Fred, and Henry. Mary and Rose never married, so when their mother passed away in the 1880s, they took care of the ranch and the boys, raising the boys. They all went to school, for a while at least, at the San Ramon Grammar School down in the town of San Ramon. Now, Fred, among his ranching and rodeo activities, he provided stock for Harry Rowell for the rodeos that were held. The Dublin Rodeo, I think, was the early name of it. So Fred had lots of different agricultural activities, and Howard went to Davis and then came back and used his agricultural skills on the ranch in a variety of crops also. So that house still stands. It's a great place to live. Still pretty much the way it was. Mary and Rose, my great aunts and Jeff's great aunts, were, because they weren't married, had time, and I'll go into that in a little bit, but they had a wonderful big garden that they used because they fed so many of the ranch hands. Among their other activities, they kept wonderful journals. So we have some nice history of the ranch from their point of view of the crops and the animals, all the different livestock that was being raised. So the brandings that were held up near that house did bring in a lot of people to help with it and also to watch it. And that was kind of the end of the era when those brandings stopped. But you'll see some pictures of the crowds being fed at a branding when they're taking lunch. So that's all I have to say in this area. I'm Roxanne Lindsay, Roxanne Wiedemann Lindsay. I am so happy to have had the opportunity to work on this exhibit at the Museum of the San Ramon Valley, the exhibit Cowboys and Cattleman. It's important that we have a record of ranching, of agriculture in the San Ramon Valley, because it's been such an important part of the economy for the San Ramon Valley, or Contra Costa, and as part of the larger economic contribution of agriculture to the Bay Area. We have covered families that no longer ranch, but left quite a mark, and we've covered families who are still ranching, with young generations coming up that will continue. So cattle and livestock, horses, crops will all be important to this area for a long time, and I was very happy to have been asked by Beverly Lane to be part of it. Thank you.